Awesome. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to week 4 of the ABC of Contemporary Capital with David Harvey, hosted by the People's Forum. Last Sunday, we had Red Books Day here at the People's Forum. We're celebrating the creation of the Communist Manifesto, and we had a reading out loud. The video is available on our YouTube, so you should check that out. And it's not too late to post your favorite Red Books on social media and on the internet, and you can tag #RedBooksDay 2022 so that we can fight fascist repression of leftist texts around the world. If there are any questions throughout our live stream today, you can put it into the chat, and otherwise we can get started. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Talia, very much. I must say I find it rather difficult to give an ordinary class today. It seems to me that the global situation is rather terrifying, and I'm very nervous about it. I'm all too aware that the First World War broke out because some unknown archduke got assassinated in Sarajevo, and it just mounted from there. That the Second World War, which I'm old enough to remember coming to an end and remember some of the bombing and all of that kind of thing, came out of the first occupation of the Sudetenland by the Germans on the claim that most of the people on the Sudetenland were German speaking, and therefore it technically belonged to Germany rather than. So I'm watching what's going on, and I'm pretty scared because there are all sorts of unintended consequences. There are all kinds of slip-ups which can lead to disasters of various kinds, and I'm not at all confident that even with the best will in the world and with the smartest people in the world, that we're in a situation where we can avoid this escalating into something which is much more violent, and so I'm kind of concerned about that. And now I could go on at length to some of my feelings about the fact that I've never liked NATO in particular. I've always felt that the way that Russia was treated after 1991 was basically humiliated. And one of the things that happened was that partly as US foreign policy, the expansion of NATO began right up to Russia's border. Now, NATO is supposed to be a defensive organization. Why were suddenly all of those new countries like Poland and Romania and so on brought within NATO? Who are they defending against? Well, and Thomas Friedman, who writes the New York Times and who I don't necessarily like very much, pointed out that there is a certain culpability in terms of the way in which Russia was treated after 1991. It's never a good idea to engage in the politics of humiliation. This is what happened to Germany in the 1920s, and it's what happened to Russia post-Cold War. And so I think there's a lot of things to think about around the situation right now, and I don't want to go into those. And people will have different views, obviously, and I don't want to impose my views on everybody else. But it does. I felt that it was kind of crazy to sort of just walk in and give a class as if nothing's happening. Something is happening. It's big, potentially extremely dangerous. And what we have to do at this particular moment is not necessarily consistent with how we might interpret how we got to this point historically. And I suspect that everybody should reflect a little bit on that. And try to draw some lessons from the history that brought us to this point. What we do at this point, the thing is moving so fast that people are reacting immediately. You can come down on one side or the other and realize that this is still a very, very, very dangerous situation, and that we should do all we can to make sure that the leaders of the world around us take cognizance and listen to the population, because I think that nobody wants war. I don't think anybody in Russia wants war. I don't think anybody in Ukraine wants war. I don't think anybody here, apart from a few belligerent few, want war. But we may end up with war. So this is a very, very, and in fact, in some respects, in a restrictive way, we already have set up a situation of an invasion. And this is a very, like I say, it's a dangerous situation. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in on this, please do. I mean, I just thought it very important to say at least something about the situation and not act as if nothing is going on in the world that's very specific or very terrorizing right now. But frankly, this is, I've been very upset with this for a few days now, and I think that I take it seriously and feel very, very nervous about what the outcome may be. Now, it could be next week it's all gone away. I hope it does, but I have a feeling it's not going to go away. I have a feeling this is going to be long drawn out, and we're going to find ourselves advocating things that we wouldn't otherwise want to advocate because of the mechanics of the situation and the particular situation in which we find ourselves. So I think we should be thoughtful as far as we can about this and try to position ourselves in relationship to this particular situation. Well, okay, with that all in mind, and sorry to start off with such a downer, as it were, but I think that it's very, very important we acknowledge the situation. But we start off this week with some ideas, with some discussion about what we did in session 3, which is about technological dynamism and the productivity of labor. And there are, I think, a couple of things here. Firstly, Marx's theory of relative surplus value is about the reasons why technological change is so endogenous and so deeply embedded in the dynamics of a capitalist mode of production. And Marx gives a pretty good, I think, explanation of that. And so I thought it important to go over that and to make so that everybody was clear what was involved as the coercive laws of competition, in a sense, force capitalists to engage in technological change, whether they want to or not. And this, of course, gets to the point that Marx frequently makes, which is the way in which we are all of us ruled by abstractions, and the capitalists as much as anything else. And so individual capitalists are not in a position to really dictate the situation. They have to respond to the situation, and in doing so, they get caught up in leapfrogging technological innovations which continuously raise and increase the productivity of labor. But I then sort of went beyond Marx in the last part and talked about the role of the state, and in particular of interstate competition, and suggested that we might want to think about the coercive laws of interstate competition, particularly as it affects military technologies and technologies more generally, and to what degree technological mobilization for war, for situations of warfare have become very significant. And we could go further than that, and maybe we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is the general idea. And that we live in a society where, as Marx and Engels pointed out, the technological in the Communist Manifesto that capitalism is by definition a revolutionary formation in which new technologies are coming on board all the time. And in that sense, it's not the inventiveness of humanity that is suddenly discovered, it's the mobilization of that inventiveness, evidence for which exists way, way back in the historical record. The Chinese came up with all kinds of technological innovations which they never applied, but capital applies them, internalizes them, dynamizes them, and therefore we live in a society where we, in a way, we don't have a choice. I mean, it's very interesting also to ask the question, you know, everybody kind of says that capitalism is about freedom of choice. Well, but we don't have a choice. We have to engage with technological dynamism, and we have to accept technological dynamism, and that then becomes, in a sense, part of our core beliefs that technological change is good, technological change is inevitable, technological change is going to make the world a better place, when manifestly it obviously doesn't always do so. So there's almost a belief system, and that belief system is consistent with the fact that we're going to have technological dynamism whether we like it or not, and capitalists themselves have to engage with it. So these are some beginning thoughts. I'd like to sort of throw it open now to people taking the class to take up and raise any issues that they want to raise about last week's readings and writings. So who would like to kick off?
Can I just follow
Yes.
things you've been sharing, and also things that are at the end of the text about interstate competition, and the way maybe I find something a more like positive alternative envisioning is missing there, or at least we could try to think about how we can envision an alternative to interstate competition, maybe in a form of cooperation beyond the state, and that kind of examples could be great to have something like less hopeless.
Well, interstate, you know, I mean, I did suggest there that there was a clear recognition in 1945 that interstate competition in Europe in particular was a problem, and a serious problem. And that therefore, all of this stuff, setting up the common market and setting up the European Union and all those kinds of things, there was a deliberate thinking at the time, and if you go back in the literature, you'll find this, saying that this was what had to happen because interstate competition in Europe had produced 2 world wars. And that therefore a structure had to be set up, which included things like the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. So international organizations were set up to try to mollify or modify the tendency towards interstate competition. But in Europe in particular, and this was also Giovanni Arrighi's point about the importance of interstate competition in the European context. Because before that, you had empires, and empires don't internalize competition in the same kind of way. So the Chinese imperial regimes came up with all kinds of technologies, but didn't internalize them and didn't, you know, so there was not competition going on in the Chinese imperial empires, or nor was it going on in the Mughal Empire or the Ottoman Empire. So that imperial regimes tend to sort of be rather static. The one regime that was not imperial was Western Europe, where there was and it went back to Westphalia, and the definition of sovereignty of independent states, which is an argument which we're currently, is right in the headlines of the news all the time. The sovereignty of independent states was a core belief and a core value, which everybody signed on to. And that then led into interstate competition, and actually ended up with the 2 world wars. And so the argument then was, all right, what we want to do is to set up an institutional arrangement in which that interstate competition can be modified or kept under wraps. And that was what led into the European Union and all the rest of it. So, but that now leaves us in a situation where interstate competition has been translated to another, and particularly in military, it's been translated to another level. It's now between China, the United States, Europe collectively, and what was the Soviet Union and Russia. So you've still got structures of interstate competition over military prowess and military might. Now, from 1945 onwards, in the Cold War, there was a clear division of how that was going to be worked out. Within the West, there was only one power that counted, which was the United States. And so we've now got to this situation. Now, what should we do right now? And what kinds of things should we discuss right now? In some forms of interstate competition are not bad. It's over military access and military positioning and military prowess. I mean, if all the states were competing for superiority in terms of their medical care system, for example, they could sign this to say, well, okay, this is a benign form of competition. So you don't want to say all competition is bad. It's what kind of competition exists. And there is some competition which goes on between European states to this day about the social model which would prevail in Germany versus the one in France versus the one in Spain. So there's competition at that level, but there's no competition over military, over instruments of warfare and the like. So, yeah, I mean, this is one of the issues, it seems to me, that needs to, which comes out of the analysis, which is how do you create a situation in which the coercive laws of competition are still going to be there in some form or other, but how can they be contained in such a way that they are able to deal with, say, environmental degradation, climate change, social inequality, alienation, and all the rest of it. In other words, there is a macro kind of problem right now, and that macro problem is partly driven by the operation of these coercive laws of competition, and therefore one of the problems for society in general and for us politically is to start to push towards a different kind of society in which there are forms of competition which are benign as opposed to not benign, and which mobilize technologies around social well-being rather than around competition for a military ascendancy and military power. So yeah, I think that there are issues here that are very, 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 very significant. But one of the things Marx does not do is to talk about the technological dynamism that arises out of interstate competition. And I thought it very important to add that into the picture and say, well, Marx had this very good argument about relative surplus value and how it's internalized within the capitalist dynamic in the very narrow sense. But then he left to one side what I think is also very important, And in his time, it probably was not so obvious. What became obvious after 1945, particularly during the Cold War, was interstate competition, and in this case, inter-power block competition. It was playing a very, very important role in everything from aerospace and communications technologies and rocketry and all the rest of it, and nuclear power. Recognizing, however, that all those things which were developed for military reasons, and the internet was developed for military reasons, all of those things that are developed for military reasons have potentially benign civilian uses. And this is one of the big arguments about nuclear power. Okay, for military reasons, the nuclear bomb was developed. But then people turned around and said, but nuclear power has potentially a civilian use, generating power. It turned out, of course, there were problems with that, but this is true of many aspects of the innovations that come out of the arms race and which come out of the military-industrial complex. And those things are potentially very valuable. But the big question we have is how to mobilize them in that way, and how to have a political system that is capable of doing so. And that is as true for socialism as it is for capitalism.
David, I have a question for you from a student, from Robert, who cannot speak at the moment. Do you perceive there to be any developments today in production and consumption, or in developing change in social formations, which may indicate the kinds of transformations that brought capital into being in the first place?
Yeah. I don't see that being for me, that is not the important question, because capital has evolved, capital has developed. And I partly called this class an ABC of contemporary capital, to say, well, what's the contemporary situation which needs to be addressed by whatever means, and what can an idea of socialism contribute to the capacity to address those questions? I mean, climate change being an obvious issue, environmental degradation and the loss of habitat is an obvious question also. So all of these issues are there. And I would want to ask not so much what are the processes and things going on which kind of are recreating forms of capital, which I'm sure is going on in peripheral regions and has gone on, for example, in China, big time, rather than asking that kind of question, asking the question of, well, okay, we're now in this situation. What is it that we need to do in this situation, well, which will allow the creation of alternative kind of society, a non-capitalist society, where the social relations are radically different, where the environmental relations are radically different, and what would such a society look like? Anybody else want to chip in?
Sorry, I'll just jump in. So in this question of like competition versus cooperation, I'm wondering why the competition is just assumed as necessary, in the sense that even in the example you gave with like benign competition with like the medical example. I'm thinking of like how with the vaccine for COVID, for example, folks just were like, all right, everyone just throw whatever research we have on vaccines and COVID or whatever, and just like allowed researchers all over the world to access that. And that was, partly the reason that we were able to develop a vaccine so quickly. And so I think that would be a prime example of cooperation. And then competition coming in and actually being the reason that we haven't vaccinated as many people as we could, because we're prioritizing corporations and prioritizing copyright laws and all that. So I'm wondering why the assumption that competition must exist is, I don't know why it's so strong, or why, like, I don't know if that's a clear question, but.
Well, I think that, competition around the vaccines was there all along. I mean, the pharmaceutical companies, I think, knew perfectly well that if they got there first, they would, they would be doing fantastically well in the stock market valuation and all the rest of it. But they needed the resources to do that. And so the public sector, of course, pumped in vast amounts of money and basically says, you have as much money as you want. And in a way, it internalized competition. Now, this is interesting, because you internalize competition within the pharmaceutical sector. So you have J&J, you have Moderna, you have Pfizer, and you have AstraZeneca, and so on. They've all, and you basically say to them, okay, we give you the resources, and you go ahead and see what you can come up with. And if you come up with it, you will be able to then reap the benefits. Now, this is something very interesting, because in pharmaceutical products, I think it's back around 1975, many of the drug companies, of course, fund their research through the National Institute of Health. In other words, it's public money that is taken by the drug companies. And in 1975, there was an adjustment to the law. Before that, public monies would be given to, say, Pfizer, and then Pfizer and the public would share in the benefits. Okay. In 1975, they changed all of that. The big pharma got to did what it does in politics in this country, and said, yeah, you can use the public money, but you get all of the benefits. In other words, big pharma would get all of the benefits from and I think that happened around 1975. I'm speaking from memory, I may have it wrong. But up until that time, there was a public-private partnership, and now this happened also with AIDS and so on, and so all of those drugs were developed with public monies. It was all NIH money, but NIH was not allowed to recuperate any money for the public sector from the drugs. And all of it went to and this is where big pharma has become so big, because it basically takes public money, like NIH, does the research, develops a proprietary drug of some kind or other, and maintains the rights to it, and can become a monopolist in terms of pricing and all the rest of it. So this is a crazy system in my view. I think it's scandalous. And therefore, there should be a return to the system that prevailed before, where the public sector, which funds the research, should get a return on its investment, and it should go half and half with, or whatever proportionality is deemed appropriate, with the big pharma companies. Now, competition is very important, and it's you can have a negative view of it, but actually what you find inside of the corporations, the big corporations, is that they frequently internalize competition between different branches. And there's a very interesting book by a guy called Tracy Kidder called The Soul of the New Machine. And it's about Dell computers and how they came up with a new computer, a new computer kind of structure. And the way they did it was, Dell was this vast corporation, but it had an agency in Boston, one in Atlanta, one in California, and one somewhere. I don't know how many, I can't remember how many there were, but there were several parts of Dell, all of which were told that we need to build this new computer and we need to find ways to do it as fast as we can. And you're in competition with the guys in Atlanta, and you're in competition with the guys in Boston, and blah, 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 blah. So you internalize competition within the corporation, because what the corporations found was that if they had a monopoly structure, their dynamism was not strong. But when they internalize competition, right, between, you know, in the way that Dell did, then they're much faster. So internalizing competition within the corporation became a pretty much of a standard practice from the late 1960s onwards, because monopoly corporations become bureaucratized. They you know, things. This is the argument against many socialist forms of organization. They become bureaucratized. People become fixed in their ways. They develop a certain culture of hierarchy and organization, and therefore are not dynamic enough to be able to meet particular new challenges. And this is so internalizing competition within a corporation or within a social system becomes a very, very important feature, which brings dynamism and creates dynamism. So if you want technological change and you want technological dynamism, then you have to do it by internalizing competition. Now, so this is something which is very very important to realize about China. I mean, everybody looks at China and thinks of it as a monopoly structure. It's not. It's highly decentralized. The Chinese sort of Politburo comes up with a target. It wants to develop a new, it's like the new computer stuff. It wants to develop a new computer. It wants to develop artificial intelligence. How does it go about it? Well, instead of kind of saying, well, we have a big state bureaucracy that will do it, they basically created a whole, in a sense, a whole section of Beijing was turned into a sort of a innovation alley where all kinds of people were invited. Basically, they lived rent-free and they were told to go ahead and come up with whatever they could do in terms of artificial intelligence. And it was a crazy competition. And China is where it is in terms of artificial intelligence right now because of the internalization of that crazy competition in that area of Beijing. State policies in China, central policies in China, they typically turn to all of the municipalities and all of the regions and say, well, we've got a problem, we want a solution to this problem, you go ahead and find the best way to do it. And then there's competition. And if you're ambitious and you want to get on in the party, you get yourself elected mayor, you get yourself appointed, not elected, you get appointed mayor of some municipality somewhere. And when you're mayor of the municipality, you try to solve as many problems as you possibly can. And then you go to the sort of central committee and say, see, I'm a great problem solver. And they say, oh, well, you were looking after this municipality in Jiangxing. Why don't you take over Shanghai? So that's the way they move up into the politics. So internalizing competition is terribly important to maintain the dynamism of any organization. It's terribly important in terms of the development of new ideas. So I would want to say that I personally don't think there's anything terribly wrong with competition in itself. It's how it is structured and how it is realized and how it is utilized that becomes the problem, and what it's competition about. I'd like there to be competition about, healthcare, say school standards or something. I'd like there to be competition of that sort. But I don't want to see competition over rocketry. I don't want to see competition over nuclear weapons and so on. So again, it's not a question of competition good or bad. It's a question of what competition is going to, how it's going to be mobilized and how it's going to be utilized. And I think that one of the things that people recognized in, say, Europe in 1945 was that interstate competition was bad, was producing bad results. So you tried to create an alternative kind of societal structure in which all of the states of Europe were put into a collaborative box. With, by the way, a great deal of support from the United States. I mean, the European Union was in some respects a project of the United States, because the United States, people in the United States basically were saying, hey, we got dragged into 2 world wars because those goddamn Europeans got into a fight. So we've got to stop those Europeans fighting. And how are we going to do it? We set up a structure that kind of makes it hard for them to do so. And so that then comes to the, if you like, the geopolitics and the politics of a situation and the like. So I think this whole kind of question of what is competition and how does it work and so on, it's not about, you know, kind of saying it's inherently bad or it's inherently good. It's a question of how it is mobilized, because in a funny sort of way, when I mention about Dell Computer and the internalization of sort of the struggle to build a new machine, in a way it was a form of cooperation. I mean, that was competition is in a sense a form of cooperation. The cooperative result is that you get a new computer, and it's a very sophisticated machine, and you can take it to market and you can win. In other words, what you're doing is you're trying to set up a situation of competition, which produces a collaborative and cooperative result for so that again, I would want to sort of approach the question that way, and of course Marx was recognized that competition in the market was one of the ways in which capital developed these coercive laws of competition, in which you would be forced to extend the length of the working day or whatever it is, or forced to develop more intensive forms of labor or new technologies and so on through market competition. So one of the answers to that is, of course, to reduce market competition. If you think the results of that are bad, you reduce market competition, which happens with monopoly power and happens with, of course, state intervention. So the state then enters in. But if the state doesn't internalize competition within itself, you tend to get stagnation, which is nothing wrong with stagnation, provided everybody's living in a reasonably good sort of state. I mean, I'd be very happy to stagnate in certain situations, you know, and I think that, you know, that would be great. But there's the sort of general issue which it seems to me that Marx addresses very well in terms of relative surplus value, but doesn't go on to these other areas. Just add one thing to that, which I didn't introduce into the paper, which I think I should. And that is, at a certain point, I kind of said, you know, innovation becomes a business. You know, the machine tool industry sits there and makes more new machine tools and finds uses for these machine tools. So if you go on a building site now and you look at the kinds of, you know, drills and things that people can, you know, utilize in building a house, I mean, if you watch somebody building a house these days compared with building a house back in 1945, you would see people with nails and hammers going bang, bang, bang. You now see people with these kind of fast screw things going vroom, 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 vroom. Well, that didn't come out of some guy on a building site thinking that was a good idea to make. That came out of somebody looking around and saying, hey, we can build something here. And they develop these machine tools. So if you look at a company like Skills or whatever it is, and look at machine tools used in building, I mean, people can drill things and, you know, put screws in wood and metal and cut things. And I mean, the technology is absolutely incredible, but a lot of that technology has arisen not from the building sites, but from companies which are finding new ways in which to say, okay, people need to drill holes. How are they going to do it, and do it in a way that's super fast and with almost no human energy involved, because you just take the drill and kind of electronic drill and go boom. So when it becomes a business, then the interesting question is that what's the business for? What's the business about? Now, I mentioned the business of house building, for example, and so you can kind of say, all right, well, there's a business there which is home tools, and you'll go to Home Depot and you'll find all of these tools around to do all kinds of things, most of which terrify me because I think that I'm going to drill a hole in my foot if I ever get close to them. But then there are certain other things that get invented, and you start to look at these and you realize that, so for instance, some of the platforms, technological platforms right now, they're being used to extract value from the population. In other words, technology is being applied to what I call accumulation by dispossession. There's a whole kind of a industry of getting people's money out, or defrauding them, or doing something or other. So technology is kind of when you say technology is a business, you say, what kind of business is it? When it's helping to build houses, it's positive, but there are certain technologies which are about basically stealing from people, finding ways to hack Bitcoin or those sorts of things. So suddenly somebody makes up with $1 million worth of Bitcoins, and they just disappear, because people have got the technology to somehow or other do it. So the technological innovation and the kind of business that is technology, well, business is also supplying the mafia as well as supplying the house builders. And so this is something that seems to me important to ask the question, what kind of business is it? When we say that technology is a business, what kind of business is it? Who organizes the business? What is the mobilizing of the business? In Marx's day, this was not the case. He recognized that technology would become a business, and in the machine tool trades, we find that going on, and he was aware of that in his time. But the kind of business that technology is these days is something which is way, way beyond anything I think that Marx had in mind. And if we want to think about this in the contemporary situation, then we've got to add to Marx this idea and develop further this idea that Marx has about technology, new technologies becoming a business, and talk about what kind of businesses it is, and to recognize both the positive and the negative aspects of that.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a couple questions, but I wanted to start going back to the text from last week. Just a point that I think I was confused by that I hope you could clarify, which is that you said that when the price of commodities that are necessary for life fall, that leads to a decrease in the value of labor power. But then you also said that when the price of commodities declined in the US, like in the Walmart example, that it didn't lead to a decrease in wages, but it led to an increase in worker standard of living. So those to me seem opposite. I mean, and I'm wondering what you think is the difference in determining who benefits from the decline in commodity prices. If it increases the like exploitation, or if it increases the workers' benefit.
Yeah, well, the simple way to look at this is to say, well, let's suppose you have a company and you're operating and you need 10 units of value to buy all of the means of production. You need to pay your workers 10 units of value to cover their wages. And you get 10 units of value of surplus value, which is going to be the profit. So, you know, it's divided up 10, 10, 10. Let's suppose there's the workers live on bread alone. Okay, they just consume one commodity. And the value of that commodity declines because an automated bakery comes into existence, okay? So now, instead of needing 10 units of value to pay to your laborers, you can just give your laborers 8 units of value, because that 8 units of value gives them enough bread, exactly what they got before, for 10 units of value. In other words, the cheaper bread means that you can lower the wages, right? And as you lower the wages, you then get to the situation that you're paying 10 for your means of production. You're paying 8 units for your labor, which is now giving you the same amount of bread with 8 units instead of 10. Okay. And that then means that if you're getting the same amount of surplus value, you're now getting 12 units of surplus value. Okay, instead of 10. So S over V is now big, is now gone bigger. Okay. Right? Because now the other thing can happen is that when the price of bread goes down, for a variety of reasons, the capitalists may decide that, well, laborers ought to get some of this. They're pretty hungry. They need a bit more bread. And if they have more bread, they'll produce better and all the rest of it. So the price of bread goes down. But instead of putting it down to 8 units, you put it down to 9 units. In other words, you split the benefits of the technological change, and 1 unit goes to capital and 1 unit goes to labor. So labor shares, if you like, in the benefits of technological change. Now, the other thing that can happen is that you give the worker 10 units all of the time, and you never reduce it, but you find that the 10 units can actually buy more and more and more, because the price of consumer durables, for example, is going down. The reason I mentioned the Walmart economy was because since the 1970s or so, the real wages have been pretty stagnant in most advanced capitalist countries, and the share of wages in national income has in fact gone down in most advanced capitalist countries. And you would expect from that there will be a declining standard of living. But there's not been a declining standard of living, because the Chinese are now producing commodities which are so dirt cheap that even with the same wage, you can buy a lot much more stuff. So you feel like you're much wealthier than you were, even though you're receiving the same wage, because it's much more value. You know, you can get much more value for it in terms of commodities. Now, this was something that happened actually in Britain when I mentioned this about the corn laws, what the British call the corn laws, which is wheat laws. That the cost of bread is obviously terribly important to defining an adequate wage rate. And in Britain in the 1840s, the cost of bread was high because there were high tariffs upon imported wheat. And high tariffs on imported wheat were there because the landlord class, the aristocracy, was very, very powerful in Parliament, and it refused, it insisted on there be tariffs on imported wheat to keep the price of their wheat up high. Well, a power shift occurred, I don't know, 1940s, something like that, in which the Corn Laws were repealed. So you now got cheap wheat coming in, and the result is the tremendous depression and the disempowerment of the landlord class, which of course the industrial class were very happy about. But at the same time, the industrial class has said to the workers, you should support us in our getting cheaper bread, because you need bread. And the workers themselves thought it was a very good idea, and so they supported the whole thing about abolition of the Corn Laws. After the abolition of the Corn Laws, what did the industrial capitalists do? They depressed wages. They cut wages down. They basically said, well, bread's cheaper, so you need the same amount of bread as you got before. So now we're going to reduce wages because bread is cheaper. So this is what part of the argument that goes on. Now, the reason this is important is because if you kind of casually mention to some neoclassical economists, if you're unfortunate enough to know one, there is a rising rate of exploitation of labor power, they'll kind of say, my God, when Marx was writing, there was nothing. Workers had nothing. Now they've got a car, they've got a television, they've got all those consumer durables in the kitchen and all those kinds of things. They're much, much better off. So this theory of a rising rate of exploitation is absolutely bunkum, right? Well, it's not. If you say, well, the rising rate, the exploitation is defined by the gap between what is produced and what is given to labor. That gap can be very high in advanced capitalist societies, which led me, as somebody got very upset at me saying, well, in fact, a well-paid German worker may be more exploited, maybe, not necessarily, maybe more exploited than that person who's working in Bangladesh for a mere pittance and is not really able to produce very much. And I think there's a little bit of a problem here arises because when Marx first wrote about this, he called this the rate of surplus value. That is, S over V was called the rate of surplus value. And what he found was that by calling it the rate of surplus value, working people kind of shrugged their shoulders and said, well, okay, yeah. So he found that if he called it the rate of exploitation, workers responded more positively, said, oh yeah, rising rate of exploitation. Yeah, okay, yeah, no, I get the feel of that. So he changed the language from rate of surplus value to rate of exploitation, mainly for emotive political reasons. But as a result of that, it then creates this problem, that we've been talking about, which is, contemporary economists kind of saying, well, the rate of exploitation obviously is not increased because, the workers have a much higher standard of living now than they had when Marx was writing. Does that?
I mean, it does answer, but I guess I still don't understand, in the two different examples, the corn law example and the Walmart example, you're saying that in the Walmart example, workers happen to benefit with increased standards of living just because the capitalists decided to share the additional surplus with them?
No, they didn't. No, in the Walmart case, they didn't decide to share.
Well, they did because they didn't. I mean, you're saying that they left wages at the same rate.
At the same rate, but you could buy more with it, yes.
But according to what you're saying, when the prices of commodities fell, they should have been able to decrease wages.
Yes.
Why were they not able to?
Well, in some ways, first off, it is actually politically rather difficult to reduce wages.
Yeah.
Historically, if you announce suddenly wage cuts, all hell breaks loose and things go. So first off, there's that. in this case, it wasn't that so much. It was also the problem that if you're paying your workers less, at some point or other, you have a problem in the market. I mean, Marx has an interesting comment at one point. He says, you know, every single capitalist wants all the other capitalists to raise wages so that there's a market for my product, while I want to decrease wages in order to increase my profit. So that's the second main reason, which is that the market is if you shrink the working class and working class becomes less and less affluent, you've got a problem in the market, or you may run into a problem in the market. So and you know, like historically, the whole history of capital, by and large, has accepted that there is some kind of way in which the benefits of increasing productivity are shared between capital and labor, and doesn't all go to capital. Whereas since the 1970s, the tendency has been for it all to go to capital, with the result there's this tremendous inequality in society and all the rest of it, and that there has not been, which has meant that then capital has some problems about finding the market. And there have been signs of that in recent times, but my argument was, well, one of the things you did was you turned to the workers and said, oh, you want stuff? Why don't you borrow money? Give you a credit card, and then you can become indebted and all the rest of it. So there are various issues of that kind. And you know, there are always people around who kind of regard the kinds of wage rates which are existing as pitiful and immoral, and that people working for $7 an hour is a scandal, and that so there's a bourgeois consciousness there, a bourgeois conscience, if you like, which often comes into play as well, and says, you know, you should pay your workers an adequate wage. But Marx's point, of course, was that coercive laws of competition are likely to intervene even with workers, even with capitalists who are reasonably benevolent when it comes towards the wage rate of their workers.
Thank you.
Any other kind of issues? All right, it's about time, therefore, that I switch to the part that you don't like, which is me reading the text for next week. And this is a bit of a strange intervention that I'm going to do today. But I think you might see the logic of it more towards the end. And session 4 I call Marx in Manchester. Marx set his theoretical investigations of the laws of motion of capital in the context of British industrial capitalism between 1840s and his death in 1883. He did so in the belief that, and I quote, "The country that is the most developed industrially only shows to the less developed the image of its own future." Now, you may or may not agree with that, but that's what he believed. Now, in this, he was fortunate to find a huge archive of investigative materials assembled by the British state-appointed factory inspectors, public health officials, and parliamentary inquiries on everything from child labour to banking practices. He fulsomely acknowledged the importance of these materials for his own interpretations and complained at the wretched state of information from elsewhere. And I quote him again, "We should be appalled at our own circumstances if, as in England, our government and parliament periodically appointed commissions of inquiry into economic conditions. If these commissions were armed with the same plenary powers to get at the truth, if it were possible to find for this purpose as competent, as free of partisanship and respect of persons as are England's factory inspectors, her medical reporters on public health, her commissioners of inquiry into the exploitation of women and children, into conditions of nourishment, and so on. The English factory inspectors and health officials like Leonard Horner, Mr. Scriven, and Dr. Greenshaw, to name a few, were key figures. Imagine how bereft and unsatisfying the first volume of Capital would be without the substance provided by the accounts of these state officials. And it's important to remember, these were not socialists, these were not crazies on the left, these were just state officials appointed by the bourgeois state. Marx also collected a vast trove of contemporary press reports, pamphlets, and relevant books, such as those of Urim Babbage on machine technology. Finally, his friend and patron Engels not only inspired him through his early and remarkable work, The Condition of the English Working Class in 1844, but also supplied continuous commentary on labour and life in Manchester, as recorded through Engels' first-hand experience helping to manage his family firm in the city. To top it all, Engels also got to see Manchester through the eyes of his Irish working-class companion and lover, Mary Burns. It was through her that Engels was introduced to the fetid squalor of the living quarters of the proletarian Irish immigrants of the city. The historical materialist foundation that Marx always craved for in his theoretical work came from the likes of Leonard Horner, Mary Burns, and Engels. It is this that gives such a powerful aura of authenticity to Marx's writings. It is this that then explains how and why Marx's theorizations from that time echo down to us so convincingly, even though we are living in such different times. Nevertheless, it is crucial to recognize that Marx is universalizing about the capitalist mode of production by way of the particularity of the British experience in general and the Manchester experience in particular. But it was not only an image of everyone else's future that Marx's descriptions conveyed. The image of what might constitute a socialist or communist alternative was also at stake. This image, in Marx's view, was not to be derived out of idealist utopian reflection of the sort that the socialist utopians of the 1840s were fond of creating, which Marx and Engels had so assiduously rejected in the Communist Manifesto. It was constituted through a historical materialist negation of all that was so dreadful on the ground at that time and in that place. The immediate grounding in Marx's case was heavily reliant on mass production and social reproduction in the industrial region of Manchester. The cruel conditions of the labouring masses in the factories, workshops, and down the mines, along with the equally pitiful conditions of social reproduction in the industrial urbanization that capital had created, and that Engels had so pointedly described, all of these called out for negation. The material circumstances and the socialist project to which they pointed spoke for themselves. The focus on in Manchester industrialism also entailed confronting the particularities of the labour process in the cotton mills and the nature of the labour market it defined. The power loom weavers were essentially machine minders. The transfer of skills from the laborer into the machine, a transfer that Marx makes much of in Capital, entailed a de-skilling of much of the labour force. Unskilled Irish labour could easily substitute for what had traditionally been the semi-skilled artisans that worked the hand looms, albeit through the putting out system in which merchants provided the raw materials and gathered back the finished product on a timely basis. The depressing effect upon wages and living conditions affected through the employment of Irish labourers posed a problem for Marx. Initially scathing in his criticism of the Irish for their role in redefining the value of labour power downwards, he later came to recognise that the answer lay in raising the Irish labour force up as a necessary first step in the organisation of class struggle. For the mill owners, division within the working class based on gender, ethnicity, national identity and religion, many of the Irish being Catholic, except in Northern Ireland where Protestants dominated, these divisions were more than welcome. It could be argued, perhaps, that Marx's focus on the particularities of Manchester's industrial capitalism biased his vision in some respects, and that his preoccupation with the doctrines of the free market, competition, and free trade, promoted by the industrialists of the so-called Manchester School of Cobden and Bright, ideas which also called out for negation, somewhat warped his vision. But the factory inspectors, the public health officials, and the parliamentary reports did not confine their observations to Manchester. They went all over the place. And Marx was well aware of the distinctive influence of the Manchester industrial faction in the realm of ideology and politics, as well as in their enormous, for that time, centralization of economic wealth and power. The results were, in a sense, predictable, and Marx outlines them very explicitly in Volume 1 of Capital. And I quote him, "One fine morning in the year 1836, Nassau W. Sr., a man famed for his economic science and his beautiful style, was summoned from Oxford to Manchester to learn in the latter place the political economy he taught in the former. What Senior learned, and I go on my own language now, was that the capitalist profit was totally encompassed by the last hour of work in a 12-hour day, and that any shortening of that day to, say, 10 hours would spell ruination for the capitalist system because profit would disappear. Profit originated in the last hour." This so-called analysis, in quotation marks, prompted a fierce rebuttal, as much directed to the British Parliament as to Nassau Senior, by none other than Leonard Horner, who worked with the factory inspectors from 1833 to 1857, and, I quoted, "whose services to the English working class will never be forgotten." And of course, the 10 Hours Act was finally passed. The shortening of the length of the working day was, Marx opined, one small but critical step towards a socialist future. It opened a pathway to the realm of freedom, understood, in Marx's terms, as free time for the working classes. For the Manchester industrialists of that time, a different kind of freedom, His Holiness free trade, as Marx called it, was the only kind of freedom that mattered. The economics of free trade was lauded to the skies by the Manchester School and incorporated into state policies in the country, and with respect to the industries that at that time dominated in world capitalism. Free trade, it turns out, is always the mantra of the leading capitalist industries and powers. The elaboration and instantiation of the doctrine in the form of the World Trade Organization, the WTO agreements, in the late 1990s, at the behest of the major global corporations and the United States, the hegemonic power of the moment, is the obvious case in point today. In June 1849, Marx, however, moved to London. He stayed in London for the rest of his life. While not a participant in British politics, he followed British political life closely by way of press reports and parliamentary debates. For a while, he earned some much-needed income as London correspondent of the New York Herald Tribune. During the 1850s, he tried to make sense of British imperial politics, for New York readers, covering, among other things, the barbarity of the Indian Sepoy Rebellion of 1857-8, the equal barbarity of the Second Chinese Opium War of 1858, and the dissolution of the East India Company in favor of British direct imperial rule over India. These were, incidentally, the years where Marx was intensely engaged in writing on texts like the Grundrisse. The connection back to Manchester free trade politics was obvious. As he noted in 1853, the ruling classes of Great Britain had had till now but an accidental, transitory, and exceptional interest in the progress of India. The aristocracy wanted to conquer it, the moneyocracy to plunder it, and the millocracy to undersell it. But now the tables are turned. The millocracy have discovered that the transformation of India into a reproductive country has become of vital importance to them. The Indian market had for some time been a major recipient of the huge increase in output of the Lancashire cotton industry. Imperial power had assured the destruction of a long-standing indigenous handloom cotton industry in favor of becoming inundated with English twists and cotton stuffs. The necessity for opening of new markets or extending the old one was as pressing in India as it was in China, and failure to do either signaled an approaching industrial crisis due in large part, he said, diminished demand for the produce of Manchester and Glasgow. The Milocracy answer was to rationalize the space economy of India by building railroads. Prior to this, the Indians could not use machinery to work up their cotton, which is sent by ox carts, sometimes over 800 miles over wet lands, to be shipped to the Ganges, thence around the Cape of Good Hope to England, to be fabricated and then returned to the natives at whatever percent, above 90%, such an operation costs. The Milocracy wanted, needed, and eventually got a railroad system that gave access to cheap raw materials and spatially integrated markets across the Indian subcontinent. Marx records the astonishing increase in British trade in cotton goods to India. It rose from £2.5 million to £6.1 million in just 3 years, from 1856 to 1859. While the British bourgeoisie in general, and the Milocracy in particular, were motivated by the vilest of interests and promoted their endeavours with the most blatant hypocrisies, the building of the railroads would, Marx hopefully supposed, ultimately mean the building of an industrial system in India which would dissolve the hereditary divisions of labour upon which rest the Indian castes, whose decisive impediments to Indian progress and Indian power resided. The stirring up of revolutionary sentiments might, Marx hypothesized, create opportunities for socialist revolutions, though this would depend upon how the now ruling classes in Britain shall have been supplanted by the industrial proletariat. The relations between Manchester industrialism, imperialism, and class struggle were evident, though partly masked by doctrines of free trade that in Marx's times were supported by the Manchester School of Economics and the works of J.S. Mill. The Manchester materialist anchor in Marx's thought produced a critical theory on the role of imperialism, albeit as experienced and understood from the center rather than from the periphery, as later articulated in the works of subaltern thinkers. If 40 years after Nassau Senior had been summoned to Manchester, he had been summoned to Birmingham, he would have encountered a rather different industrial structure with a different mode of labor exploitation, resting on rapidly rising labor productivity. Much of the production was relatively small scale compared to the gargantuan cotton mills, and often highly skilled, even with some degree of primitive mechanization. For example, the Bolton and Watt steam engine was manufactured in Smethwick, for example, a suburb of Birmingham. The whole West Midlands region was dominated by a machine tools and metalworking sector that was very different from the cotton mills of Lancashire or the woolen mills of Yorkshire. Above all, Birmingham was the centre of gun making and specialised in the production of military equipment, munitions, and artillery. The market for such products is very much tied to state expenditures and state contracts. But the status of the defense industries and the role of what is conventionally referred to in the USA as the military-industrial complex is something far beyond what Marx could have envisioned. I give, however, a contemporary example. In the midst of the Reagan recession of 1982, when unemployment topped 10% and Paul Volcker, then president of the Federal Reserve, raised interest rates, I think it was to around 14%, to confront an inflation rate was, I think, up around 17%. In the face of that, Reagan ruthlessly cut back on all forms of social expenditure, reduced the top tax rate from around 70% to 35%. And I'd like to remind people that at no point between 1945 and 1975 did the top tax rate in the United States fall below 70%. Since 1975, of course, it's barely ever risen much above 38%. Reagan also confronted and broke PATCO, the Air Traffic Controller Union. But at the same time, he launched into a massive increase in defense spending to challenge the Soviet Union to a gargantuan arms race, which in the long run the Soviets disastrously lost. While the rest of the USA swooned in economic depression, the defense industries, scattered in a great arc from Virginia through the Carolinas, across Texas to Los Angeles, and up to Boeing in Seattle, boomed in an astonishing wave of what some people called military Keynesianism, since it was all deficit finance, leading Republicans like Dick Cheney later to opportunistically say, in the George W. Bush years, that Reagan taught us that deficits do not matter. Precision engineering and gun and steam engine making entail very different labor qualities from minding a cotton loom. Almost a century later, the West Midlands was the industrial region in which the automobile industry took root. And towards the end of the World War I, it built the prototypes of the tanks that would play such a leading role in World War II. All of this was anchored in cities like Coventry, Aston, and even Oxford, with Birmingham celebrated for its guns and jewelry as its commercial centre, while totally avoiding Manchester and the cotton towns of Lancashire. In the United States, the Massachusetts industrial model of the textile towns like Lowell was likewise radically different to that of steel towns like Pittsburgh, or in later times, that of automobiles in Detroit. Marx might have ended up telling a rather different theoretical story in Capital had he focused on Birmingham industrialism, one where technological change had early on become, as he himself had predicted, a business in itself. Here was a form of industrial organization that drew heavily on agglomeration economies, of the sort that Marx had recognized and commented upon in Capital, even as Manchester always remained the lodestar to guide its inquiries. In the case of Birmingham, the industrialism depended upon the existence of or emergence of a labor force with distinctive machine tool skills and modest but livable wage levels in a cultural environment where the working class was primarily divided on the basis of mental versus manual capacities. A workman possessed of the skills in metal forging and the making of steam engines was valuable, and employers had to prevent workers being lured away by rival firms in Belgium, France, and indeed all over the continent. Conversely, Birmingham manufacturers were happy to employ skilled workers from no matter what background, Polish, Prussian, etc. Diversity of ethnic or religious background did not matter, as it plainly did in Manchester, as long as the skills were there. The image of the future that this experience proposed was rather different from that given by the Manchester experience of the 1840s. When the International Working Men's Association was founded in London in 1864, with Marx prominent in its formation, these were the kinds of skilled and literate workers who were involved from France, Italy, Switzerland, Spain, and the like. The watchmakers of the Jura Mountains regions along the French-Swiss border were legendary in their political sophistication. The split between Marxist and anarchist currents had not yet occurred. These were the organizers who collected and sent money in support of strikes and other agitations occurring throughout Europe in the late 1860s, culminating in the Paris Commune of 1871, in which international participation was important and welcomed. By 1870 or so, the Conservative mayor of Birmingham, the industrialist Joseph Chamberlain, popularly known as Radical Joe, was exploring civic reforms in the social provision of gas and potable water, popular education, and the housing for the improvement of the respectable and adequately skilled working classes. Gas and water socialism was at that time seen as a feasible answer to a whole range of officially acknowledged ills, backed by abundant manifestations of local labor discontent. Radical Joe took steps to realize such a possibility. The fact that Radical Joe later became a leading advocate for colonial expansionism, the South African Boer War was his most notable contribution, was in part impelled by the Conservative Party's reaction to his reformism and his recognition that if internal reforms were blocked by prevailing class power, then the only option to expand the market for continuous economic growth was to seek out a spatial fix in the form of colonial ventures, along with the domination and cultivation of foreign markets. The notorious partitioning of Africa by the colonial powers at the Berlin Conference of 1885 was the culmination of a phase of interstate geopolitical rivalries over access to foreign markets. The image of the future defined by the Manchester industrialism in the 1840s and 1850s plainly did not apply to Birmingham in the 1870s. If Engels' father had had an industrial establishment in the jewellery, gun and machine tool trades in Birmingham rather than a textile factory in Manchester, capital might have read rather differently. But against this seeming bias, Marx had the factory inspectors' reports and the writings of an increasingly militant working class that focused on capital in general, rather than the cotton factories in particular. Any casual observer might be forgiven in any case for thinking the Manchester image certainly still does apply, and then in spades, to the conditions of life and labour in the Rana Plaza textile and apparel factory, 20 miles outside of Dhaka in Bangladesh, which collapsed, killing 1,129 workers, mostly women, and wounding many more on April 24th, 2013. Producing textiles and name-brand apparel for Western markets, the factories were under constant pressure to cut costs for the benefit of Western consumers. Wages were close to starvation levels and factory discipline fierce. The same could be said of the Foxconn production complex in Shenzhen, China, which produces most of Apple's products and employed some 250,000, some said 400,000 workers as of 2011 in one vast factory complex. A spate of worker suicides in that year persuaded the company to festoon the cramped company-provided living quarters of the migrant workers with mile upon netting to capture anyone who jumped. It is all too easy to take descriptions of labour and life conditions in these parts of the world, euphemistically dubbed emerging markets, and insert them into Marx's chapter on the working day and capital, without noticing the difference. To the populations living under conditions, a dollop of gas and water socialism, along with some internal social reforms of the radical Joe's sort, would seem like a gift from heaven. Capitalism is an evolving system characterized by a great deal of uneven geographical development, the qualities of which are often reflected in the particular theories to which economists subscribed. Marx noted, for example, that the US economist Carey reflected the needs of US infant industries by promoting import substitution industrial policies, which later emerged in Latin America. The French economist Bastiat fiercely promoted market freedoms and the virtues of laissez-faire. And he did so in a context where the French industrialists were struggling to free themselves from the shackles of a costly and inconvenient patchwork of state regulation and taxes. This too later echoed in Latin America after the neoliberal refutation of ECLA and the advance of free trade policies favored by Pinochet and the Argentinian generals. It therefore follows that the question of socialism must be constructed to negate that which is currently alienating, unacceptable, and threatening in today's world. And this, however, is constantly shifting and geographically diverse. These questions call for the closest attention, because in the history of anti-capitalist oppositional politics, there has been a tendency to fix and fetishize a certain imaginary of a socialist future as an ideal ahistorical construct. In the same way that Keynes feared we were in perpetual danger of becoming slaves to the thought of some long-defunct economist, so the political threat of obeisance to the ideals and ideas of some long-defunct socialist or communist project also looms. The fixity of our mental conceptions acts as a drag upon our ability to think, let alone freely act upon the political projects now required to create a more just, more ecologically acceptable, and more emancipatory socialist world. To put it in such terms is not to invite yet another bout of utopian dreaming, though a little of that would not hurt. It is to construct an accurate, properly theorized account of what capital is currently about, much as the factory inspectors provided back in Marx's time. And on that basis, take feasible steps towards the creation of a freshly minted socialist alternative, freshly conceived, and adequate to our current situation. What this might mean depends upon geographical conditions. The problems posed by capital in Latin America are quite different from those in Sweden, where the whole country went into mourning with the death of the founder of IKEA, who was lionized as a folk hero. Yet there is a distressing habit of theorizing socialism as a political project outside of any historical and geographical grounding, even if capital's basic laws of motion are invariant and universal enough within capitalism, demand and command respect everywhere. When China entered the global economy after 1978, and in particular when it signed on to the WTO in 2001, it had no choice but to submit to the laws of motion of capital. It is the operation of these laws that connects the industrialism of Manchester in the 1840s to contemporary conditions in Shenzhen's Foxconn factories and those of Rana Plaza in Bangladesh. It also explains why China is now modeling itself on Silicon Valley, a very different imaginary of a capitalist future, while attempting some version of gas and water socialism along with common prosperity zones through equal access to housing, healthcare, and education. While Marx's work is open to critique and dismissal as that of some long-defunct economist, we still live under the rule of capital. The admittedly incomplete theory of capital circulation and accumulation that Marx laid out is plainly still relevant. His theorizing transcended the particularities of Manchester, and his concrete abstractions are robust and flexible enough to encompass Manchester and Birmingham or Shenzhen and Silicon Valley, provided, of course, we allow for the particular contextual conditions. In Marx's time, the industrial form of capital, its distinctive laws of motion, dominated only in Britain, Western Europe, and the eastern seaboard of the United States. But in our times, thanks to the relentless push to create an ever-deepening and ever-expanding world market almost everywhere, is subsumed under the laws of motion of capital that Marx uncovered. Marx's account of these laws and how they work is more relevant than ever, which is not to say they cannot be improved and extended, or that problems of interpretation and application should not trouble us. The sparse and inferior qualities of information about which Marx complained is no longer with us as a problem. We have abundant forms of information right now. In a sense, we suffer from a plethora rather than a scarcity of information. Techniques of mass data mining and media manipulation have proliferated. But there is also a lot of misinformation, labeled these days as fake news. The surfeit of information is in some respects a problem rather than a blessing. There is so much of it. Much of the public either cannot possibly get to all of it, let alone understand it. Not a few so-called experts who are called upon to enlighten us appear to be confused, as everyone else, when they manage to lay aside ideological predilections long implanted by centuries of misleading bourgeois scholarship. This leaves us with serious problems. It was relatively easy for Marx to see the big picture, at least from the perspective of Manchester industrialism and the factory inspectors' reports, and to envision the negations that would define a socialist project for that place and time. The challenge for us is seemingly far more complicated and perhaps indeterminate. And I then end up with that there seems to be, of course, an upsurge of political struggles around labor issues in these times. We see these struggles in India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and China. But the majority of the big mass movements in recent times have been centered on the failure of the dominant economic model to deliver the necessary qualities of daily life to satisfy even the minimal needs of the mass of the population. The ever-increasing levels of social inequality, as measured primarily in financial and asset wealth, as well as in income terms, engenders powerful currents of resentment through relative deprivation. The austerity that is all too often demanded might be acceptable if we were not also aware of the enormous increments of wealth and power being sucked out of the economy by legitimate and illegitimate means by the oligarchs and autocrats who command the springs of power and wield such immense influence over public policy. While the explicit movements against the own 1% fail to last, the bitter taste and arbitrariness of the increasing rather than decreasing inequality lives on. This is the kind of situation that provokes a historical materialist grounding for someone like Piketty to play the role of preacher of the futures of socialism. So how should we interpret this history and this situation in relation to any emergent socialist strategy? A socialist politics has to recognize the qualities, problems, and contestations that arise within the totality of the circulation of labor capacity, as well as at the point at which it intersects with the accumulation of capital. When alienation dominates all the different moments of the circulation of labor capacities, then deep troubles lie ahead. This is something that the so-called analysis of contemporary economics goes a long way to concealing, rather than revealing. Well, I've taken us right up to 7:50, so I think one of the main issues that I would like you to reflect upon is the situatedness of knowledge and the relationship between the particularities of your experience, the experiences of those around you, and the experiences which you're exposed through documentaries and the like. To reflect on all of that and then think in terms of, what this tells you about the current situation and what kinds of things need to be negated to get us out of some of the more pressing dilemmas that we face. We can't do that without having a certain grounding in the realities around us. But my realities are very different from yours, and your realities are very different from workers in Bangladesh or China, Shenzhen, or wherever. And therefore, what we have to do is one of the reasons I wanted to resituate Marx a bit against this background is to say he drew magnificently in many ways upon those things that around him which could provide a historical materialist basis for his theorizing. We have to do the same thing. We just can't take what he did and say, okay, that's the answer. We can read it. It's a fantastic thing to read simply because of what it does and how he goes about doing things. And there are many truths in there. When I say that what happened to the Rana Plaza factory and what happened in say the sweatshirt fire in New York in 1914 or whenever it was, and what was happening in Marx's time in the factories of Manchester. Yes, there's commonalities there, and I think we should trade upon the commonalities. But I think we also have to recognize the importance of the differences, and to recognize that we need to rethink exactly what we might mean by what kind of socialism, what is the imaginary of our future around us, how we deploy that, and what is the basis, therefore, of the kind of socialism we might construct. And that basis looks very different if we're sitting in Silicon Valley or we're sitting in Dhaka in Bangladesh or Shenzhen in China and so on. So how do we put those things together in a political project? Seems to me to be one of the big questions to be asked in our time. Okay, anybody got any kind of comments I want to ask? Any questions coming from the web? Yeah. Well, if there's nobody there, I guess we should close it down right now, and next week we'll come back. Okay.
Great. Thank you, David, and thank you, everybody. We will see you next week, and the lecture will be posted on davidharvey.org.
Okay. Bye now.